Hi guys, Russia wants to invade Ukraine and it's about to happen. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in 1 week, maybe in 1 month, nobody knows, but the fake news needs to feed you with this crap pretty much on everyday basis. As a guy who was born in Russia and hold Ukrainian citizenship, I want to give you a crystal clear explanation about what's going on there. For the last 8 years, pretty much every 2 months there is a news that Russia is about to invade Ukraine, with all the details of the upcoming operation. However, all this news were published on Ukrainian or Russian media resources to solve certain political agenda in the respective countries. This time, all this news are coming from CNN and New York Times, from exactly the same journalists who were telling us about Steele dossier, about Trump being on the prostitutes on one of the Moscow's hotel. Now we know that the real author of this dossier was Igor Danchenko, some kind of a random uneducated loser, and the whole dossier was a pure fiction. Do you think Russian army is so naive to leak all these secret plans to the media about their upcoming invasion of Ukraine? When Russia took Crimea back in 2014, or when they started a hybrid war in the eastern Ukraine, these journalists somehow failed to tell us about that beforehand. Clearly, Putin plays some weird games to stay relevant in the West and negotiate some potential deals. This is a very common strategy for all modern dictatorships, including North Korea and Iran. The huge difference this time is that US actively plays the same game. There is no secret that Biden's approval rating is extremely low. The recent polling was showing something like 33%. If you cannot solve the COVID crisis, nor can you stop the prices from rising within the United States, the only way you can improve your rating is to save the world. And Biden constantly calls to Putin and tells us that he managed to de-escalate the situation and prevented the next world war. Americans buy this, and Biden's rating is still more than 0%. Now let's challenge the current media narrative. Putin annexed Crimea back in 2014 because it was a Russian-speaking area, and now he wants to get more of these same Russian-speaking areas in eastern and southern Ukraine. The obvious question here is that why Putin needed to wait for 8 years to make this annexation? And media has no answer to that. My answer is that Crimea is a very special case. To explain this, I need to tell you a little bit about history, and if you're Russian or Ukrainian, most likely you will be offended because it contradicts to what you've been learned in high school. Just 120 years ago, there were no Russia nor Ukraine. There was something called Russian Empire, with a bunch of different people speaking various dialects. There were also no Russian or Ukrainian nations, contrary to the Western world where we have already at this point French or English nations, for example. Why do I say such a bold and offending statement? Look at the Russian Empire census from 1897. 80% of adult population in the peripheral regions cannot read or write. If you consider only rural population, this number goes as high as 90+%. If you consider only women, this number is close to 100%. There is no way you can explain an illiterate man that he belongs to certain ancient nation and there is a village 100 kilometers away from here and the people there belongs to the same nation. Simply because of the fact that this poor peasant has no concept of map and the only information he gets from the outside world is coming from his local priest. And by the way, the first Bible was translated to Russian back in 1876. This tells you a lot about the prestige of Russian language back then. In short, most of the Russian Empire was a savage and illiterate place just 120 years ago, contrary to the Western world. Peasants back then were using different Ukrainian and Russian dialects, but this was not part of their identity. Now the actual history of Southern Ukraine and Crimea. Before the year 1764, Southern Ukraine was a buffer zone between Russian Empire and Ottoman Empire. Basically, it was a giant wasteland with no cities and some nomadic population. After several successful wars against Ottoman, the Empress of the Russia, Catherine the Great, managed to annex this land and started the colonization of that region, which was named the New Russia. Catherine the Great, despite being a Russian empress, was ethnically German, born and raised in German land. She invited a bunch of people from Germany and other European countries to come and settle these new lands, including many Jews. So despite of the very confusing name New Russia, which Putin really likes to use, this was a truly multi-ethnical project. The story of Crimea is quite similar. It was annexed back in 1783. The difference there is that there were a bunch of settlements of Crimean Tatars. Some of them stayed, others were forced to migrate. So what was the common language of these newly acquired lands? If you look at the same census from 1893, in Taurida Governorate, which includes the modern Crimea and a bit more of contemporary Ukraine, the languages are the following. Ukrainian 42%, Russian 28%, Tatar 14%, Germans 5.4%, Yiddish 3.8%. Quite a mix, but Ukrainian clearly leads here, but it's far from the majority. But if you look at the city population of the same region, the situation is completely different. Russian 49%, Tatar 17%, Yiddish 12%, Ukrainian 10%, German 1.5%. Russian clearly is the preferred language among the city dwellers, with almost a majority. And to be clear again, these are not nationalities but the mother tongues. People in the cities naturally move to Russian as their primary tongue, so you might have some ethnically Germans or Jews who selected Russian as their mother tongue. Now let's compare this with Yekaterinoslav Governorate, which includes modern Donetsk and Luhansk. These are the places where currently Russian-supported civil war is going on. Here, Ukrainian has a strong majority overall, but in the cities, Russian has a plurality, with Ukrainian having a bit strong influence than in Taurida. Now, with all this knowledge, you can clearly understand what is the root of the conflict. When the empire splits into a bunch of nation-states, you have one populations in cities which prefer Russian identity and you have the rest population in the villages which prefer Ukrainian identity. Then you have a significant minorities of Jews and Germans which has no place in these newly created nation-states. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1918 and the Soviet Union was created, the nation-building process took off along with the growth of literacy. The problem was that in the Soviet Union you had two different types of identity. First, you were Soviet, the great part of the world proletariat. Second was your nationality, which was decided by the local government official, and they actually put this information into your ID. Like, you could have a Soviet passport, living in Ukrainian Soviet Republic and being Russian as your nationality. Soviets believed that these imaginary nations one day will become real, like the one in the Western world, but it was not always the case. So, returning to Crimea, how it was transformed to Russian-speaking region. Crimea was one of the places in the Soviet Union which had partial subtropical climate, and it was a dream vacation spot for the most of the proletariat. For the upper class in Moscow, it was a dream place to spend their retirement days. And as the result, a bunch of educated Russian-speaking people moved there over time. These people were not ignorant peasants and strongly identified them with Russian nations and had close ties to Moscow. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this population got extremely unhappy because now they have to be part of Ukrainian nation state, especially considering that they were part of Russian Socialist Republic before 1954, when Crimea land was internally transferred to Ukrainian Socialistic Republic by Nikita Khrushchev. In 2014, when Ukraine got revolution and the opportunity came, Putin decided to bloodlessly took the peninsula under the Russian control. Both Crimean and Russian population were extremely happy about this decision. The Putin ratings went up and the initial response from the international community was quite weak. So potentially Crimea could have been recognized as the part of Russia in the very long future, as it happened to the French island of Mayotte. But Putin decided maybe it's time to get even more of Ukrainian lands. The assumption was that the whole southern Ukraine is pretty much Russian-speaking and they could repeat the same successful story as they did in Crimea. So Putin started to initiate a pro-Russian insurrections inside the eastern and southern Ukraine. The problem was that Russian speakers in Ukraine doesn't really feel themselves as Russians, contrary to the Crimea case. They don't feel 100% Ukrainian, to be clear. The nation is not fully formed there, contrary to Crimea when you had a bunch of recent migration from Moscow. A Russian-speaking population in Ukraine prefer more democratic and pro-European Ukraine contrary to authoritarian Putin. The only regions where insurrections were successful were Donetsk and Luhansk, and only partially and only with the strong support of Russian-backed paramilitary. When Putin realized that Russian Spring didn't work, he decided to invite all the criminals from Russia to come as volunteers and pretend that they're local farmers and miners, they're fighting for their freedom and actually being a paramilitary and do whatever they want. Obviously, everything was done in the way to completely deny any official Russian involvement. Basically, instead of annexing these regions, which Putin surely could have done, he decided to make a little terrorist state like Hamas. the only purpose of which is to create a constant problem for Ukraine. For the last 8 years, this strategy worked quite well. Ukraine can't join NATO because NATO would not accept any country with an active military conflict, and Putin can always threat the West that he will continue the invasion of Ukraine. Let me repeat, Putin could have annexed these regions in the same way as he did with the Crimea, but he has zero interest to do that. No one wants to manage a terrorist state, and Russian population in Russia is quite aware of what's going on there, and they don't want to be that particular region to be part of Russia. Putin's rating won't go up. Plus, it's not 2014 and he doesn't really care about his rating any longer. Since Russia transformed from the mixed democracy when Putin was able to legitimately elect himself with the majority of population to the current state when he is no longer popular and he needs to fake the election to be able to stay in power. The final question to answer is why Putin would not annex the whole Ukraine and declare it as part of Russia. Putin maybe is a crazy man, but not at that extent. First of all, Russian army is a joke. Yes, Russians possess nuclear weapons, but the most important nowadays is to have a strong drone forces, which Russia clearly lacks. If you look at many operations in Syria and Libya, you can see that Russian forces were pretty much decimated with the drone forces. Second, Putin is no longer popular, and the only reason he keeps power is because elites support him. And the reason why elite supports him is that he allows them to use certain corruption schemes and enrich themselves at the extremely large scale. The elites in Russia are not stupid, so they transfer all their stolen capital back to the West as soon as they can. If Russia annexes Ukraine proper, there will be an extensive sanctions against the elite, and they will not be able to access their capital from the abroad. And the next day, Putin will be removed from the office. Let's see how the situation develops. I hope and believe that there's gonna be no war. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time. Bye.